Welcome to the webinar today, everyone. My name is Matt Jacobson. I am the Online Learning Coordinator for the Learning Technology Center of Illinois, and I'm happy to be here with you today. I'd like to remind everyone that we are recording this webinar today. Recordings will be posted on the LTC's YouTube channel within 24 to 48 hours. Illinois PD credit is also available for those attending live today. Evaluation emails will be sent out also within 24 to 48 hours of the end of today's event. If you have any questions today, please feel free to type those into the chat or the Q&A. I'll be happy to monitor both of those as we're going along today. If you do use the chat, please make sure to change that little blue drop-down menu in the chat box from host and panelists to read everyone so that we can all read your questions and benefit from the responses. Today, I am happy to introduce you to my colleague, Eric Santos, who is our Regional Ed Tech Coordinator for the Chicagoland area. And today, Eric will be talking with us a little bit about how to get started with STEM Labs. Eric, I think you have the ability to share your screen and unmute yourself, so please, by all means, take it away.
All right, thank you, Matt, and thank you for having me here. Sharing my screen now, so hopefully you all can see my slides. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This is the STEM Lab and Makerspace Starter Kit. And if you're watching this, you might fall into one of these categories. You might be at a school or at a district where you're thinking about creating a new space, either a STEM lab or a makerspace. You might be renovating a space. You might have one existing that you want to rethink, or you might just have a classroom where you say, you know, I'm really bought into this idea of 21st century learning and student collaboration and authentic work and making, and I want my classroom to reflect that a little bit more. Regardless of where you're at with that, hopefully you'll find this useful. This is a session that I will share my experience, and I'll share with you some suggestions for the things to think about, having been through this a bit myself and having had some successes and also had some mistakes, which is why I chose this template for my presentation, because innovation is a series of mistakes and redos and great ideas that you cross out and remake over and over. And so that's kind of the thread here today. Before I get started, or as I'm getting started, obviously this is a webinar, so you're muted, but I would love to hear from you in the chat. Share a little bit about your name, location, role, and if you can, where are you in your STEM lab or makerspace journey? Obviously it's 3:30ish, so if you're on the car ride home, don't do any of those things, but if you're able to, please do type in the chat so I can see who we've got here. Also, I'm using STEM Lab and Makerspace, and that's a mouthful. There's overlap, and then there's subtle differences between the two. So we'll just call them innovative spaces to make it easier. If you're developing an innovative space, here's the steps that I would take to kind of begin that. First, a little bit about me as you're introducing yourselves in the chat. As Matt mentioned, I'm the Regional Ed Tech Coordinator for the LTC of Illinois. I serve the Chicagoland area, the purple counties that you see shown on that map in the bottom right. Previous to that, I was in education for 11 years as a STEM and science and technology educator, mostly at the middle school level. I served for 4 years as a technology coach, and now here I am with the LTC. And I also serve as an adjunct for teacher prep programs, and I've done some secondary science curriculum writing and reviewing, and then some of my badges are right there. You can scan that QR code if you'd like to learn more about me. So that's me, but more importantly, I want to talk really quickly about my STEM lab experience so you can kind of see where I'm coming from, and I am speaking from a few instances of my own experience, as well as some things that I've seen in visiting labs in other locations. Some of my STEM experience background, I really got into getting my students into STEM related competitions. So on the left, you can see some that different students groups have won. I've linked to some of them because some of them are really just great programs to be a part of and competitions to engage in. And even if you don't engage in the actual competition, I found that some of the materials and the approaches to projects there could be easily applicable in your classroom to add that STEM component to your classroom. I've also ran several after-school clubs that are related to STEM. So Rube Goldberg, student news clubs, coding clubs, chess clubs, astronomy clubs. A variety of them use a lot of materials. And so, as you'll see in my presentation, managing those materials is part of what you want to think through as you do this. So that's some of my STEM experience. And a lot of it involving STEM labs and maker spaces boils down to three specific experiences that I'm going to draw a lot from today. The first one I'll call the Dream Lab, and you'll see a lot of pictures of that today. I call it that because the space was absolutely dreamy. It was an extremely large former woodshop space. When woodshop kind of went out of favor for a while, they moved all of the fitness equipment from the gym in there. And then when STEM came around and became the new thing that schools were moving back towards, we ended up moving all that fitness equipment back out and redesigning that entire lab. My students won a competition in which they managed to win quite a large sum of grant money, and the district then got behind it and threw some more renovation money at. And so that was a full rehab of an existing amazing space that I understand not everyone will have access to. And so that's why that's called the Dream Lab. But there's a lot you can learn from that experience that I can share. My second experience is what I call the home ec room. I worked at a district that was just starting a new STEM program. They were moving on from their home economics, or what they call now consumer sciences class. And so I was in that former classroom. It was a nice space size-wise, but it had these very large desks that were attached to the floor and had sewing machines that came out of them. It had ovens and stoves that were still active, and sinks. And so it was a mix of like nice space, but also some things that made it a little harder to move around in the current idea of a mobile and flexible classroom. And then finally, my last experience was a computer lab, a decommissioned computer lab. You know, the school went one-to-one. They no longer needed 30 computer labs stationary in one room. They moved most of those out, and it was just kind of an open space to be used, which was nice, but you know, it wasn't as big as maybe the Dream Lab was, and there were still two classes that used that space throughout the day, so it was a little tricky with the logistics. I share that background experience with you all to tell you that regardless of where you find yourself, whether you have a room, a less than ideal room, or a really awesome space to work with, there are principles and approaches to designing that space that are pretty similar, and you can make it happen with whatever you have. Um, and so hopefully, even if some of the things I shared today don't apply specifically to your situation, you can at least grab some ideas that do. So here's a quick GIF, and I do say the hard G for GIF, of a 3D blueprint that I made for that Dream Lab space. And I share this to show you that one, planning is important, but two, as you'll see in some of the pictures, the plan didn't always work out exactly as I intended. So I went in with big goals and big, the big crazy, what's the best that we can do with this space? And, you know, sometimes things go the way you want, and some things just don't quite fit in the budget or don't quite fit in what you're trying to do. And that's an important expectation to keep in mind. So here's actual pictures of the space that we renovated. On the top left is a look at the Dream Lab before. We really got a lot of things done in the space. As you can see, they're still working on the electric, and they had just refinished the floor. And if you've ever done any kind of work with contractors in your own home, you probably know things don't always go according to schedule, right? So the students actually came back to school before we were finished renovating. We had to work with what we had in that bottom picture. These were tables that were just kind of sitting in a storage room that weren't being used by anyone. We grabbed them, we put some tennis balls on the bottom of their legs so that they could slide around easily, and we worked with what we had. On the top right, you can see we slowly but surely started adding some mobile furniture and some more monitors, and painting the walls and so forth. So this was a work in progress constantly. Students were using it as it was being renovated. You know, when they went on break, we would add a little bit more. And so it was just a work in progress always. But if you don't have that large of a space, this is a video, and I'll share these slides with you at the end, but this is a video that I highly recommend taking a look at. This is a very standard size classroom, I would say, maybe even I would argue smaller than many classrooms out there. And this teacher has managed to fit just about every STEM and makerspace type of activity and tool and technology I could think of into this one space. Very creative use of walls, use of those storage bins, and use of shelves wherever possible in mobile storage. So again, you don't have to have a dream space available to you to make great things happen. You just have to get a little creative with the space that you have. All right, so with that said, how do I actually get started? That was a little background on me and a little background on the approach But here are 4 steps that I recommend, whether you have a huge space, whether you're doing a minor renovation, or just rethinking a classroom use. I recommend these 4 big steps. Establish your vision, plan the big picture, design your space, and then go get the fun stuff. Notice that the fun stuff's at the end, right? I'm not going to get really deep into like comparisons of which robotics program or which 3D printer to buy, or because that's a whole other conversation. And quite honestly, that's a big enough topic to have an entire extra webinar on. I do want to say that it's important to think through those first 3 steps first before you start diving in and trying to make purchases and trying to make those decisions. Now, doesn't always work out that way. Maybe you got a grant for 3D printers and you've got a bunch and you want to start building from there. Or maybe you've already got an existing robotics program, but now you're like, we want to build on that. Maybe you've got a teacher who's already doing great junkyard wars type of projects, right? With cardboard and tape everywhere. And you're like, how do we make this a thing for everyone? And that happens. So then we'll just go back through 1 through 3 and then think those through. So let's start with number 1, establish your vision. So establishing your vision really gets down to the idea of remembering your why. Why do you want to create this space and why is this important to your students? Because of that, I won't be able to give you the one answer to everything. I won't be able to give you the one explanation of here's what you buy, here's how you arrangement do this, because it's going to be different for everybody. And it's going to be different for your students in the space that you're creating. But it's important to do some of the work of at least thinking or rethinking through some of this. I see establish your vision as 3 steps: finding inspiration, building your team, and developing your mission, vision, and goals. For inspiration, I've got a variety of links there that you can see once I share this presentation with you, as well as, I shared some of those pictures already. And I've also got some pictures throughout this presentation from Deerfield School District 109 and District 99, Downers Grove in the Chicagoland area. But definitely look through some pictures of examples of existing spaces and mine for gold. Find those things that are useful that you think can be applied to your space. I'd also say build your team and cast a wide net there. You want stakeholders who are involved and bought in. You'll need administrators to sign off on the ideas that you have, the purchases you want to make, and you'll need them to be able to sell it to their board if this is going to involve a major investment. If you're going to have coaches and specialists helping, you'll want them involved. Teachers that are going to use the space should be involved in decision making, and even as much as you can, students and parents, and getting their feedback about what you want this space to be. And then finally, your mission, vision, and goals. So let me talk a little bit about establishing your vision and what that would look like. And I'll start with 2 quotes. One is, if you don't know where you are going, you might wind up someplace else, by the great quote master Yogi Berra. And the important thing there is just make sure you have a plan. And so what I would do is, if this is appropriate to you, if this is a big undertaking, you might write out a mission and a vision for this space. Your mission is your purpose. Why do you exist? Why does the space exist? And your vision is, how will you achieve it? What will you actually do to achieve it? We don't want to just fill it with buzzwords. Really think through, why are we building this space, or why are we creating this? Why are we repurposing this room and moving this equipment out and moving this new equipment in? And if you can put that on paper, then you're going to be in a strong place to make sure you align back to that goal and just don't focus everything on what's the cool new tech that we're going to buy. What's this one project that we're really attached to? So here's a quick example of what that might look like from another STEM lab. So the mission and the vision, the mission would be to promote and improve STEM education by creating STEM proficient members of society, and so on. So this is basically, why do we exist? Why does this space exist? And then the vision is, how will we do that? Well, we will inspire and prepare learners through authentic creative projects that foster innovation, collaboration, and problem solving. Well, great. Now everything that we do with this space and every purchase we make and every change we make, we need to go back to that vision and say, are we doing those things? Is this getting us closer to that goal? So, again, if this is a smaller thing where you're just doing part of a classroom, maybe this becomes less important and you don't spend a ton of time on this, but I think it is a good thought process to think through, as well as setting some goals. Especially if you're doing a big makeover of a space, think through, like, what is success going to look like? How many students do you want accessing it? How many hours of work on a certain curriculum or a certain type of project do you want to see? Can you set something concrete to say, yeah, this was a worthwhile investment? So I think those are all worthwhile steps. But also remember this, especially if you're creating a space that you're hoping that teachers will bring students to visit, or that you're hoping that students will come visit on their own. And I have seen that where some spaces were set up where it wasn't attached to a specific course or a specific class. It was more just an open space where teachers could sign up and bring their kids to do a project, or kids could drop in at lunch or at recess and decide to work on something. But just remember, if your team that's going to be using this space is still not quite in the mind space of what a makerspace is, if they didn't watch last week's webinar about the makerspace mindset and they're not on board with some of these ideas, you risk building a space that maybe doesn't accomplish those goals because everyone involved isn't quite on board. So some things to think about is that buying the new toys and getting the new kits that you're excited about and building out a cool space won't change anything if the mentalities haven't changed. So you need to make sure the team involved that would be using this space really believes in some really important things. And here's a few that I'd like to put up there: that failure is inevitable and desirable, and that there's going to be change and there's going to be mistakes made as you use this space. If your teachers are comfortable with not being in tight control of what students are working on at all times and are comfortable with letting them kind of explore a little bit and letting them learn by doing. If they're comfortable with students being noisy and being a little messy and maybe not getting it right the first time, if they're comfortable with students learning different things at different paces, then you might be in a good place. But if they're not quite at that mentality yet, you don't want to build a space that doesn't get used or just ends up being the same type of education without that real change. And so if your staff or your team that's working on this isn't there yet, here are some great options for professional learning. And again, these are all linked, so when you have the slides, you can click on any of these, but feel free to do a book study with these or pass them out or read them independently and kind of get yourself in the mind space of what do I use a makerspace for and how is the learning and teaching different in that space. So I really think that mind space and that mindset is important to start with. All right, so once you've kind of got yourself in a good headspace and once you've got that goal setting and that mission statement written out, now it's time to start planning the big picture. What is my space going to look like? What are the things I need to be thinking about? And here's where the starter kit really comes in. Again, I started with a Dream Lab SketchUp creation, a 3D model that I developed of what I wanted this space to look like. And there were all of these things that went into the building of that space that at the time I didn't realize, number one, that all of these issues would be important, and number two, as this graphic shows, just how interconnected they are. And these are the 5 areas that I would say you really need to think through, especially the bigger the space or the bigger the renovation, the more that these 5 become important to really think through. But even if you're renovating a small space, things like the physical space and things like the funds that are going to be involved in your innovative space are really important to think through. And here's a breakdown of those 5 things. First, think about, is the space that we want to create, is this new construction? Or are we repurposing something existing? And if we're repurposing, what are some of the challenges and benefits of that space that we want to use? A couple of quick thoughts on that. If you're renovating an older space, do you have access to the utilities that you need in that space? Do you have access to all the electrical outlets and chargers you'll need for all the gadgets that you're going to be buying? And are they placed in a place where students can easily access them? Do you have enough storage available in this space for the projects your students will be doing? If this is more a STEM lab on the side of like science teaching, is there access to sinks that students might need? Is there access to gas if it's a high school classroom and they need that? So just thinking through some of those space considerations is really important up front, because once you're in that space, you're in that space. Access is the next one, and specifically thinking about how are students accessing this space. And you really want to define this, because I've seen it not go well, and I've seen it go well. Is this a space for a specific class? Are you building this for the STEM teacher, for the science teacher, for this program you're putting together? If so, great, you have a clear purpose. You might consider saying, are all of our students benefiting? How many students are taking that class? Is this just for one specific teacher on this 3rd grade team or on this 5th grade team? And are we now playing the lottery where if students get this teacher, they get this amazing makerspace, but if they don't get that teacher, now they don't get that same experience? So just think about clarifying the goals of that class and how many students are benefiting and how can we maximize that number. If this is a space where you want it to be either by teacher sign up or by drop in for students, just keep in mind exactly what is the purpose of that space, what's the process for teachers signing up, and then how are you going to ensure equity that everyone has access and all students can use it and can get the experience. This was a challenge I faced when I had to redo that computer room because two classes were still using it, and there was another adjoined program that was very accustomed to just popping into the space whenever they needed to have a student conversation. And so there was some culture change that had to happen there. And it became challenging for a middle school class to use it because there were two periods throughout the day where their students couldn't get in because another class was there. So there was some communication that had to happen to make sure there was equitable use of the space, and it was challenging. And if students are dropping in, make sure you're marketing. And I would even say that with teacher sign up, think about the marketing of how do you get people to want to use this space? Is there staff training involved? Is there an opportunity for teachers to come in and just learn as the students would and understand what a maker project looks like and what's involved from a student perspective? And do you have the logistics kind of worked out of how that'll happen and who's going to staff this space? I helped once with on a smaller scale with an elementary makerspace that was going to be students dropping in during lunch where they can choose not to go to recess and could instead come in and build things with Legos or build small circuitry projects or just build things. And so we had to manage the logistics of, do we have enough volunteers committed enough to be here during these periods every day? So that's something important to think through. And keep in mind, the old adage of if you build it, they will come may not necessarily come true. You've got to get teachers and students bought in that this is a space that they want to use. So think through how you get access that marketing component of things. All right, and that kind of builds into staffing. So who's in charge of this space? And specifically thinking about replenishing materials. If you're doing 3D printing in this space and you've got to keep replenishing that filament or things break, which they will, who's in charge of making the calls to support or spending all day on Google trying to fix something? Who's in charge of keeping track of those materials? Who's training teachers on how to use this space? And how are we making sure new teachers come in and know how to use the tools as well? We want to make sure that a space that you're creating isn't so attached to one staff member that should that staff member not be there, the space becomes functionally obsolete. So it might be useful to clarify that space's purpose. Remember, going back to the mission and vision and attaching that to someone's role, whether it's a coach, a specialist, a specific teacher, and just be clear about, this role now involves managing this new space and managing these new materials and equipment that we have. And this is a program and not just, one person's passion project. And we don't want it to die with that when that person leaves the school or when that person's not available to teach it anymore. I'll also just say a quick word, think about curriculum. There's two routes to go. There's off the shelf, and I've listed there several really good examples of curriculum, both paid and free. And if you go to that CK12 one, there's a really good, and a colleague of mine, Joe, would be able to talk even more in detail. He's very passionate about this, former science teacher, but there's some really good science and engineering curricula there that you can get for free. The other route is to go teacher created. And a lot of you might be already going that route. If you're here, you might be that teacher or know that teacher who is super motivated, who develops their own project-based learning units, who adapts things they find and constantly has new ideas. And I'll just say, if you're an administrator in the room right now, that's an awesome way to go because you're getting custom made units for your classes, but do invest in those teachers and coaches and specialists who are designing that curriculum. Curriculum developer is a full-time job that requires, if you go on LinkedIn and look for some jobs related to curriculum developer, it's a pretty intense set of requirements to get in the door, and it's a full-time job and it's not easy. So definitely invest the time to block out some time in the summer or time after school or whatever's needed where those teachers or coaches can actually develop the curriculum and not have to try and squeeze it in on their free time. So those are two routes to go with curriculum. Funding is another consideration, and keep in mind, like with the first Dream Lab that I created, a lot of it was grant funded to start with, but we had to consider the robotics kits that we were buying. They were going to get obsolete at some point. Parts were going to get lost. Pieces were going to be needed. Every year they had a new competition that the company put out, and we'd have to buy a brand new set of materials to go with that competition. So the one-time cost is important to consider, but make sure when you're developing your budget, you're thinking through yearly replacement costs and the price of replacing lost parts. Is there a support program that you can buy, or are you going to be fixing this thing on your own when something breaks? So I think that's important to think through. Here's a few things, and I won't go through this whole slide, but here's a few sources you can think about, both within the school budget as well as some external grants that you can look into. Again, you'll have these slides so you can click through and read through this in more detail, but maybe something to share with the decision makers in your district. And we do have another wonderful staff member, Mindy, who, if you want to reach out to me, I can put you in contact. She is our funding expert, and she could definitely speak more to this in detail with you. All right, so you've kind of thought through those big picture items. And if I've scared you away a little bit, don't let that scare you. This could be a much quicker conversation than any of that was, depending on where you're at in the development of your STEM lab or makerspace. But I think it's important just to put all those ideas out there for you. So now let's get to the even more fun part, designing that space. So what is it going to look like? So here's the 6 considerations that I think of, and some of these I've touched on already, but here there'll be lots of pictures and ideas here for you to dig into. These are the 6 design considerations I would recommend focusing on and thinking about. And when you're looking for inspiration and looking at other labs and looking at pictures, put these 6 down on a sticky note and kind of take notes on what you're finding. So the first tip is storage. And the first tip about storage is, no matter how much you think you need more than that. Consistently, in my experience and other STEM teachers and makerspace facilitators that I've talked to, space is always at a premium. So there's a lot of ways to accomplish that. Obviously, there's large, wall units, there's modular storage, mobile storage, but even just bins, buckets, baskets, and baggies for the little parts and the projects students are working on but not finished with. All of those can be part of the costs and part of the things you'll want to have on hand. Also consider the number of classes a day you'll have. The storage might look great until they start working on it and your period 1 class is done and period 2 is coming in and they're about to start working on that same project and making that same mess. And also keep in mind, a lot of the really good building type of projects can be large and awkwardly shaped and don't always fit into traditional storage. So that's where that combination of thinking through the curriculum as well as thinking through the space becomes important, because you got to think through, what are students going to be creating and are we equipped to handle that? I'd say the 2 top things that I've talked to different STEM lab operators about that they want more of: storage and open space in their classroom. And so here's a couple of quick examples of what that might look like. Obviously, again, mobile storage and modular storage that you can build on as your needs grow is important. Using wall space is huge as much as possible. And if you played a lot of Tetris growing up, this kind of thing might just be your jam. Here's a quick example that I'll share. We did a VEX robotics program at a school that I was at, and this was the Dream Lab. And one of the things that I really liked that we got right was when we built the storage, the cabinets, we put in electric right there in the cabinet. And the reason this was important was when students needed to store something, they could also be charging. And so this was a station that students were using for the robotics kit. And not only could they put it away so that the next class that wasn't doing this project could use their space, but it could also be charging and kind of not totally disassembled all at once. So that was helpful. But I also had the same program. We used VEX at a different school, and I didn't have that sweet setup with these sweet storage bins. And so I ended up with this kind of situation for our charging. And so you can see I did make some good decisions here about labeling things with letters. And I took a little PVC pipe and ran all of those cords through them to make it a little more manageable. What I figured out later, but didn't take a picture of, unfortunately, was to take a square wooden block, just a flat piece of wood. And I actually physically attached A, B, C, and D charger to that block of wood. And then I attached to E, F, G, H to that different block of wood. And I attached the associated power strip to it as well. And the reason that was important is when I needed to move all of this stuff somewhere else, I didn't have to move 8 different chargers, 2 different power strips, and a bunch of cords. I just picked up the block they were attached to and moved that entire thing over. And I can move multiple pieces at once. So just a quick little hack that helped me with managing some of this stuff. And you'll find that there's a lot of hacks out there that might help you with that you might not have thought of. Again, I talked about large and awkward projects. So this was one of my favorite of all time. This was the aerospace engineering project where my students had to build a model of a moon base that was self-sustaining. There were many science standards attached to this, both earth science, space science, environmental science, and so on. They had to do it completely from recycled or repurposed products. Now, that is an amazing idea and they turned out great. But let me tell you, what I didn't think of is just how big those projects were, just how much random stuff was going to make its way to my classroom, and exactly where I was going to store all of this. I hadn't thought all the way through. So we had projects all over the floor, loose bottles that weren't labeled. And so I got smart the second year and I told students, you are not allowed to attach anything to the big board until you are totally done, ready, decorating it, cutting it, perfecting it, and have showed me exactly where you're going to paste it all. And then glue day is the last day. And the reason that was important is I could then take all of those 1 meter by 1 meter bases, the boards, lay them all against the wall flat and take up a minimum amount of space. And all of their materials they were building with were each in plastic bags of their own that were labeled and stored somewhere else. Way better than having them build it as they go. And some students are done, some are halfway done, some are not even close, and I just got stuff everywhere. So again, being able to store these large awkward projects is important, but also thinking through some hacks to mitigate some of the pain of that is useful as well. Keep in mind, again, with the makerspace mentality, students are going to be making a mess. They're going to be painting. You want them gluing, you want them building. And again, thinking through the storage. And for you middle school teachers, especially, and high school teachers, when you've got classes changing out, think about how you're going to store and deal with these wet paint materials and these large projects that are drying. And just think through that component of designing the space and the storage. Um, Absolutely. And so then on the right side is a makey kit. If you're not familiar, it's an awesome little circuitry kit, really helpful for developing controllers that can control your apps on your computer, your Chromebook. Things like that can be very modular, where the students are building a project, but if you have to reuse the makey piece, this little circuit board, they can just detach that circuit board, keep their project somewhere else, and the next class comes in and sits down and builds on that same circuit board and just detaches their project when they're done. So a way to save money and have one class set of these kind of things, and also maybe save a little space without having to move all of these wired projects around. So again, this is why it's important to think through what are students going to be doing in this space and how can we proactively be ready to manage the clutter that's going to be involved. Here's another case study in making. So this was my students' glue gun location. As you can see, all those wires make me very nervous. This was before we had the electrical outlets that were hanging from the ceiling all ready to go. So we were working with power cords, right? And you can only imagine the anxiety that was produced in me as 5 different students are glue gunning all in a circle and then putting those glue guns down in that area. If you've ever done this, your anxiety might be going up as well. So definitely, again, thinking through and even using the space the way students do. So maybe getting a group of teachers together and doing a project as students and just thinking through some of those logistics of storage and space. This was well before I was smart enough to look up glue gun holders. I just found this one that I actually 3D printed. That's a live picture of my 3D printer in action. If only I had found that 10 years ago, life would have turned out so different, at least in this component of my classroom. So again, find those creative ways to store things and to make your life a little easier. Another favorite of mine was water bottle rockets, again, going with that theme of large, awkward, but really fun sized projects. And there's links there for you to explore. As well as another link to a different site called Bottle Biology that uses those same 2-liter bottles for biology projects. Again, I had to consider I'm going to need to store like 100 bottles in advance as I have students bringing them in through the year so that I'm ready for this project. When they build their water powered rockets, I got to figure out where all these awkwardly shaped rockets are going to be without destroying the kids' stuff. Eventually, I found this hack where I screwed a bunch of bottle caps to a piece of a piece of wood, and then I actually screwed rocket project directly into that cap. But again, I still had to find a place to put this entire set of rockets in my classroom. So the most fun projects tend to be the most messy and tend to be the most difficult to store, and that's something you want to think through. All right, believe it or not, that was all tip one under on designing your space. The next big one is seating, and this is such a popular one. And I put seating in quotes for a reason, because seating in the 21st century looks a lot different than it did for students in the maybe in the 20th century and before, right? We're excited about flexible spaces. Students being able to maybe lay or lean somewhere in the classroom on some furniture or on the floor. Uh, Modular spaces where students can move around and be in different configurations. Standing is important for students. Let's get them moving around a little bit. They don't always have to be sitting. And again, I will reiterate, one of the most important things I hear from teachers who manage spaces like this is they really value having open spaces when needed. Having a place where they can just move everything of the way, moving the chairs, the tables, everything to the edges of the table, and having some open space for students to work. With that said, there's any number of companies that will provide you quotes on their specific equipment. I always repurpose. I guarantee you, if you talk to your custodians or your building engineers, there's some equipment, there's some tables sitting somewhere in your district that have not been used and are not being used. And someone out there can get you access to them, and at least you'll have some free furniture that you can use. And I've always managed to find some that's just sitting somewhere unloved and can be repurposed. And so you don't necessarily have to put out a ton of money for this, but you can if you want. There's some great stuff out there, as you can see in these pictures. But I would consider four setups to your classroom: independent work. So what are students doing when they're by themselves? Partner, small group, and don't forget whole class. I know that we've gotten away a lot from lecture, and we've gotten away a lot from the teacher being the dispenser of information and the center of the class. And that's good. That's the maker mindset. But there are still times where you need their attention. And if they're sitting around the table, not facing you, and you need everyone's attention, and they're not in a place, you've probably been at a PD or a workshop or a conference where you're sitting away from the guest speaker, and it's kind of awkward to have to turn and look at them the whole time. So just keep in mind, there are times where you'll need the whole class's attention, and some kind of stadium seating setup or the ability to arrange in that way is still an important component. With that in mind, I would definitely recommend blueprinting out what you want your space to look like. A simple paper pencil and maybe some color, as you can see in this right side picture, is good. You can use some graph paper. You can use Google Drawings if tech is your thing, and that's totally fine. I got a little fancy. I figured if I'm going to push the idea of buying 3D printers, I should 3D model the area. And if that's your thing, you can totally do it. I used a program called SketchUp to do this, and it let me do a whole video walkthrough of the space. It was really cool. But definitely sketch that out is the main idea here. And again, keep in mind, you may have materials that, seating materials, desks, things that you can repurpose and just use in a different way or in a different arrangement. So again, key point here, keep those open spaces. Think about the flow of your classroom and students moving it around. And again, I would recommend using the space as a group, and doing something, a student project there, and kind of feel through, does this space really work for the projects that I want students working on? I mentioned utilities. Obviously, drop down electric is a really cool one to have. Lighting is important, especially if you're going to do green screening. In this Dream Lab, we had lighting already, but we managed to put in some skylights that I had a control to open and close, so we can do natural lighting. We can close them when we needed it dark, and it worked out. What didn't work out was we only had one sink, and plumbing wasn't in the budget, so we had to make the one sink work for everything. But these are the utility things you want to think through, again, as you're thinking through how are we going to use this space. All right, my favorite of design tips is the fourth one: writable surfaces. In other words, whiteboards, could be chalkboards, any place where you could write. Again, the more the better. There's wall versions, there's mobile versions. Even those personal whiteboards are important for students. If you've got a maker mindset, if you're doing the engineering design process, students have to be able to scribble ideas, draw, write, communicate, and the more surfaces, the better. And you don't have to spend, hundreds and hundreds of dollars on a fancy whiteboard that has the nice border and the little place for the markers, those can get expensive, especially depending on the size. This is actually a picture of my basement. I went to Home Depot. They have this stuff called shower board. It's actually a writable whiteboard. It's a very popular teacher choice. There's another hack for you. Used to be like 10 bucks. I think it's kind of, inflation has bumped it up to maybe 15, 16 bucks, but you get an 8x4 board and you could just attach it right to a wall. I took some old trim and I made a border around it. Now I've got a giant writable whiteboard space. There's also stick on and paint on. So I actually, the bottom space is chalkboard that I painted on with chalkboard paint, a couple of coats of that. And I've got a chalkboard. So I've got a teenager who we can write on that whiteboard during the pandemic, remote learning, that came in really handy. And then my elementary age child loves using that chalkboard at the bottom, that it was pretty inexpensive and not very difficult to put together. But if you want to put something in your budget for spaces and you're already buying new storage, here's a really cool idea of having writable cabinet space. So 2 for the price of 1. I recently visited the Harold Washington Library in downtown Chicago. They have an awesome makerspace there. And there's nothing too revolutionary about the whiteboard other than the fact that it's big and covers, wraps around the entire room, but their use of it as a teaching tool. So even if you don't have it set up to where students can access the whiteboard and write on their own, you as a teacher can do a lot with just having that space available for teaching prompts and changing out anchor charts by writing the things that you need and drawing the things you need right on the whiteboard. So I found this to be a pretty cool use of their whiteboard space. Again, rolling whiteboards really helpful. So if you're in a room where you don't have much space to put in whiteboards, maybe you have a lot of windows, you have some, maybe you have some walls that just aren't open and available for that. Some rolling whiteboards can be really helpful and maybe even advantageous, because now you can move them where students can easily access them. If you've got students who are sitting in a funky place in the classroom that don't have a great view of the front, well, there's another option for them. I also liked it for hallway projects, and I'll even throw in here this monitor. One of the things that I liked when I was doing robotics with students was, I wanted to take them out in the hallway and work on some things. But what happens when we're out in the hallway and I'm ready to do some teaching? Well, I don't have my projector screen, I don't have my whiteboard. But if you get things mobile and you maybe put a monitor on a cart like I did, or get a rolling cart, we all remember from being kids when the teachers brought out those carts and we knew it was Friday and it was movie day. Well, that's back. And now you can use it as a teaching tool when you go out in the hallway to do projects with students. So mobile can be a good option for everybody. And finally, I just had to share this one again, back to that shower board, that white tile board idea that you can get at the big box stores. If you've got an awkward wall where a perfect rectangle doesn't fit, or you just want all the whiteboard space you can get, you could definitely, obviously talk to your admin. Don't just go nailing stuff to a wall, but you could consider that as an inexpensive way to creatively make an entire wall writable. I will say this, thinking about that, I advocated for this kind of thing in my dream lab. The district wanted something a little bit more formal and they wanted this, and that's fine. I love these whiteboards, but what you don't see, and what we didn't figure out until they were already installed, and it's not a great view from this picture, but they were a little up high for the height of my students. What that meant was this entire top half of the whiteboard as it was installed was pretty much inaccessible to my students. They could reach it, some of the taller ones, but it wasn't comfortable for the brainstorming and the prototyping I wanted them to do. And so the idea of having a whiteboard that goes floor to ceiling, the floor is actually more important. It's a lot easier to squat down and use some of that floor space than it is to jump up high and try and use some of the up top space. So this kind of setup for a whiteboard is great for a teacher who's tall enough to use that space. But for my students, it made half of the board inaccessible. And definitely that increases if you've got students with disabilities that keep them from being able to reach even some of the lower areas. You definitely want to consider that and think about accessibility for all of your students. And again, get creative. Like I mentioned, there's dry erase spray paint and paint, brush on paint. And there's also these wonderful rolls. You can do an Amazon search and find some of them where you can basically make anything into a whiteboard space. So get creative there. All right, the next really fun part of designing a space would be the large glowing rectangles, also known as digital displays, interactive panels, and so on. And we're at that 45-minute mark. Matt, if we need to wrap it up, that's fine. This might go a full hour. So let me know if I need to kind of wrap it up here, but we're getting to the end.
We're doing just fine, Eric. Thanks. Keep
Awesome,
going.
thank you. All right, so large glowing rectangles is easier to say than all the different ways to describe digital displays, interactive panels, monitors, projectors. Basically, where are you displaying information for students, but also where are they sharing information? And gone are the days where there is one large screen and the teacher accesses it, and that's good enough. Um, in fact, we kind of went with that model in my dream lab because we had a really big projector screen already there and a projector mounted to the ceiling. However, that paradigm didn't work. Students in this little section of the space, as great as the space was, they couldn't see what was going on from there. Students who were over here working on these workstations had to turn all the way around to look at my screen while looking at theirs. If there was something they needed to see while doing their work, it was extremely difficult. When students were working in full groups around this table and there were some on this side of the table, could they turn around and see that screen easily? Usually not. So that paradigm of having a single projection location is kind of gone at this point. And so here's a couple of ideas. Having some decentralized viewing is important. Remember that you don't just want the teacher to display their work. You want students to work in small groups and be able to display and present and collaborate in their groups. So how can they do that in a way that lets everybody have access to that easily? So think about what is mirroring or casting student screens going to look like. Um, Also consider, do students need an interactive display, or is it good enough for them to just have a not smart panel where they can just cast their screen to and share with their group? So we ended up getting two solutions to that. One was to install a permanent large monitor in this corner opposite the projector, and the other was to put another panel on a rolling cart of sorts so that we can move it around the room as needed. And I promise it was used for more than just playing the Nintendo Switch here on the couch. We did actually use that for academic purposes. This was another great example I saw recently. This obviously is a consumer sciences classroom, but the idea of having these monitors in specific places where students need to see them is super helpful to those students rather than one large monitor that the kids in the back can't see. This is another, and I did a terrible job of taking this picture, but hopefully you can get the idea. There's stadium seating set up for when students need to see the big teacher projector. But around this entire room, if you could imagine this monitor and workstation being repeated about 8 times throughout the exterior of the room, you've got these nice little 4 to 5 person workstations where students can connect and share their work and collaborate as a team, or the teacher can project what they need to show, and students can work in their small groups and have easy access to see the teacher's screen. So keep in mind, one of the things you'll want to think about is, what is screen mirroring going to look like for your students and your teachers? You want it to be simple, reliable, dependable, and something that the tech person isn't going to have to come down and fix every single day. And sometimes just having an HDMI port and an HDMI cord hanging there off of that thing, it might not be the most visually pleasing look for your tech, but it works every time. So consider which one of those is going to be most useful to you. All right, and the last tip, which is going to lead us into my last point, is the equipment. Thinking through the fun stuff. What are we buying and what are we building? And here's 5 quick things that I think are important to consider, especially the reusability and durability of that equipment that you choose. I'll also throw in there, if you're considering multimedia, and I really think you should, specifically green screening, that is an awesome way. And this is a real life high school multimedia studio that I visited. I believe this is Downers Grove, and it's just an amazing place. But think through all of these different things that you're going to need and consider how many students will use it at a time, and for what, and make sure you're planning accordingly and budgeting accordingly. One thing that I learned, here's a quick tip that I learned, and these are actual teachers from my previous school where I was a coach. These small mobile green screens, and even this big, this is a 12 by 10 green screen that actually folded out onto the ground as well. They end up not being as big as you think when you get people in front of them and you're trying to film a video. even this big one, these two in the middle, I could have two students or two teachers talking and performing in front of it, and I could pretty much fit them in. But once we started getting too many, or they started moving out of right from the center, it became really hard to edit that video to not have the non-green screen space on the side, not mess up the video, or I'd have to zoom in so close to them that it just didn't quite look right on the final project. So just like storage and just like open space, you're going to need more green space on that green screen than you think. So I would recommend, if you can, go full wall. Here's an example of that where there's plenty of space and it's floor to ceiling. And here's some even better, and I don't know better, but here's some even cooler, I think, like creative ways of making that green screen space. This student has a curtain that kind of runs on this rod to be able to move it. This is that, they kind of wrapped it around a corner, which super duper helps when you're filming anything to have the green space extended. But keep in mind, everything doesn't have to be full size with full size humans. There's also small green screen projects your students can do using green trifold boards, or just little green shoebox inserts that you create with cardboard. I'm sorry, with construction paper. I made this. This is my son's actual project. We got a tripod, an iPad, and put some green construction paper over a piece of cardboard, and we made a little baby shark video that he was super proud of, and we did some stop motion animation and green screening there. So you can get creative with green screening, but definitely try using it as a teacher and seeing the end results before you go too far investing into something like I did here that ended up not being quite enough to do what you wanted to do. All right, and then we'll just wrap up with the fun stuff, okay? Hopefully all of that was fun, but this is often where people start, which is the fun stuff, the tech tools. And I'm gonna go a little quick here and just kind of give you the overview. Here's a few high-tech tools you might consider. 3D design and creation is huge right now. 3D printers, CNC routers, all of that is great stuff. Engravers, cutters, robotics, game design. All of these are the high-tech things that are in high demand. I will say, out of this picture from my lab, my favorite tool was still the microwave to have on hand in class. The rest were cool too, but sometimes old tech is just as good as the new tech. Some things to think about before you jump into 3D printing. One of my colleagues, Joe, has an amazing presentation and that he's worked really hard on everything you need to know about getting started with 3D printing. I recommend checking that out, hitting him up, seeing when he's doing a webinar and watching that. Just know it requires a high amount of time and knowledge investment. You're going to have to be knowledgeable about how it works. It's not like a 2D printer where you just hit print and things go. There's a lot involved, and I highly recommend doing it because it's amazing, but just know it's an investment of time. You'll need definitely more than one. You'll need multiple, and I've talked to STEM teachers who have 3 in the room, and they're like, it's still not enough, because the projects can take anywhere from an hour to 12 hours to more to print a single project. So just keep that in mind, and that's assuming it goes right without any problems with the print. Not trying to scare you away, just want you to make sure you do your due diligence before you jump straight in. CNC routers are an awesome alternative to 3D design and integrating art, the A in STEAM, right? I do like them because they can get done. A lot of these projects can get finished a lot faster than a 3D print project can. It's a different technology. 3D printing is additive, meaning you're taking nothing and adding material to create something, whereas CNC routers and the like are they subtract away material. You take a solid block of material and you carve away until you've got the thing that you want. Keep in mind, you will need to replenish materials quite a bit. So that's a cost you want to consider. And there's a couple links to good ones there that I think you should check out. Laser engravers, again, very similar. Here's some look at some of the projects that they can create. Again, this is a costly investment, and it is a lot of knowledge you'll need, but the results are really cool and very reproducible in terms of student projects, and you're able to do small things and large things at scales that work for you. So something, and I've got a link there to my favorite, my bucket list, the Glowforge, but there's definitely others out there. Cutting machines, many of you are familiar with the Cricut. Obviously, there's a lot of really cool projects students can do. Again, you might need multiple, and there's a whole workflow that you'll want to start to learn with being able to do this. But again, think through the projects you want students doing, and how does this machine help you get there? Robotics, we can do, again, an entire presentation on comparing different robotics programs. Vex and Lego are the big ones if you're trying to get into like competitions and big time, kind of pricey programs. I loved using Vex. I thought it was awesome. But if you're not into something quite as big or complex, there's also some really good options here. I'm a big fan of Sphero personally. There's so much you can do with them, and they don't take up a ton of space. And for my elementary and primary teachers out there, and even pre-K, Robot Mouse, Bebot, Bluebot are also awesome for getting students into coding with just a little mouse character, a little B character that they can press buttons and code without even touching a computer or an iPad. So there's some really good stuff there. Circuitry and microcontrollers is something else you might look at, especially for our middle school and older students. Although for elementary students, snap circuits and squishy circuits can be a ton of fun and really accessible for them as well. So there's a lot of links to check out there for you to kind of compare some of those. And again, feel free to reach out to me. I have experience with a lot of these, and I'd be happy to talk to you about the pros and cons of each. If you would like to reach out. But don't forget self-directed tools. And I'll just kind of wrap things up by talking about letting students, outside of just the curriculum, having some student materials available for them to just free build. And that's especially important at the elementary level, to just allow them some space to freely build and not have a structured curriculum per se, if your time allows. And don't forget, a majority of what you might be doing, it could be the junk box wars style of cardboard, paper, bottles, and things you're just building out of nothing. Those are some of the most fun projects, and you'll need school supplies and you'll need to replenish those consumables. So consider that and keep those in mind with your budgeting, and keep in mind what other tools you might need. And low tech, like I said, can be a ton of fun. One of my favorite projects of all time that I still do with my own children, even though I'm not in the classroom now, is bottle rockets out of, water bottle rockets out of 2-liter bottles. This is an actual video of me having to dive out of the way as one of my students' rockets come crashing towards me. Clearly their parachute didn't deploy. One of the fun things we do is have them put a hard-boiled egg in there, and then they had to protect the egg. So it had to go as high as it could in the air, but then we graded them on how intact their hard-boiled egg was at the end. So finally, the integration of tech and low tech and high tech, eventually I figured out that we could 3D print fins and have students design different fins and test how they worked and have them 3D print them. And that was a good way to combine low and high tech. And any project you pick, even something low tech, you can build into a bigger STEM project. We had students build designs to scale. So there was math, they had to do a budget. There was math there too. They had to defend their answers and their decision making. So there was definitely some evidence-based reasoning there. They had to present in front of the class. And as you can see by their smiles, they had a ton of fun with that kind of stuff. So a couple cautions, and then we'll wrap up because we're reaching that hour mark. Be cautious about building a program around any individual. And there are some very inspired and inspirational individuals out there, but always keep in mind, and if you're that individual, keep in mind, your district will have to think about how do we keep this program going and have longevity to it and make sure all students are able to access it. Be careful building around a single technology. Kids get bored of everything eventually. That robotics program that is so exciting to them on day one, 3 years in, I hope it's still exciting to them, but just the simple fact that there's robotics available to them, they may have seen it before. I used to go into classrooms as a coach and I would bring in my AR VR kit and we'd do some virtual reality. Before I started, I thought this was like super high tech, right? Super like new leading edge. They'd never seen it before. I'd always ask, how many of you have done virtual reality stuff before? 75% of the kids have said I've done this before. Doesn't mean it's not cool, but it does mean that I have to constantly think about how can I make this a good learning experience and not just the whiz bang of a new technology that wasn't that new to them after all. Like I mentioned, consider the ongoing cost of anything you invest in, and then remember to include all your stakeholders that might be interested in how this program's going. So that was my session. I know that was a lot. I am happy to talk with you more about the details of any part of that. I hope something there was useful to you and helpful to you in your journey, and do feel free to reach out to me. The link is there, and I'll put it in the chat. And as I do that, oh, Matt's already beat me to it, of course. Awesome. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Matt, and thank you for your time.
Eric, thank you so very much for sharing that. That was a really comprehensive and informative summary of a really big undertaking. But you've also shown us some ways that it doesn't have to be so big. You can do things, you can get started with everyday materials. That's fantastic. If you do have any questions, please feel free to drop those into the chat or the Q&A, and I will go ahead and unmute our remaining participants. And if you have any questions, anything you'd like to add to the conversation, please feel free to unmute yourself and let us know. We'll pause here for just a moment to give you an opportunity to do so.
Eric, this is Kumar. It was fantastic. You did a great job going through this. There's a lot of stuff that I learned, even though I thought I knew a good amount. But on the flip side, I put in the chat too, the Google slide deck that you shared. You do need to change shared access because I'm not able to access it. Please and thank you.
Okay, we'll get to work on that. Thanks so much, Kumar. Eric, I'm guessing you probably already jumped on that, haven't you?
Changed as we speak. So if you just clicked it and you did not get access to it, go ahead and refresh and you are good to go.
All right, well, seeing no other questions, let's go ahead and bring this to a close. Many thanks to everyone who joined us today. I'd like to remind everyone that this recording will be posted on our YouTube channel within 24 to 48 hours of the close of the broadcast. And we will be sending out emails with links to an evaluation form to those of you who have attended live today, also within 24 to 48 hours. And we hope that you will come back and visit us. You can see all of our remaining webinars posted on our website at ltcillinois.org/events/webinars. Again, thanks to everyone who's joined us today. And Eric, thank you very much for sharing your wisdom with us.
For having me, Matt.